Hola chicos, en este video vamos a trabajar con saber versus conocer. In this video we'll be covering saber versus conocer, and the objective here is that by the end of the video you know when to use each verb according to the circumstances, and you should also know the conjugations or be working on them, okay? So here we go. What do they mean? ¿Qué significan? Bueno, en teoría significan to know. In theory, that's what they both mean. But just like we experienced when we did ser versus estar, there's two verbs to express to know. Just like we had two verbs to express to be. And we're having the same kind of issue here. So what we have to do is retrain our Spanish brain to think, which one are we going to use? So we'll start with saber. These are the forms of saber. You'll want to pause this and jot this down. Pay close attention to the yo form. It is irregular. Sounds goofy, yo sé. So short, right? Here we go. If you know información, okay, these can be dates, these can be numbers, these can be answers to a test question. These can be 5 plus 6 is 11, whatever. That's all types of information that you know. If you know the word for turkey in Spanish, that's something that information that you know. That's when you're going to use saber. The other thing when you use saber isn't just knowing information, but also knowing how to do something. Okay? So I know how to bake banana bread from scratch. I know how to do something, so I'm going to use saber. I know what ingredients I need. That's a piece of information, the ingredients that I need. So I'm also going to use saber in that circumstance, okay? So let's look at some examples. What I want you to do is, you know you need to use saber for these three because we're on the saber slide. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can't write these out in Spanish, making sure you're checking those conjugations, all right? When you're unpaused, we'll go over it. So here we go. I know the vocabulary. Yo sé el vocabulario. That is something I know. That's information. We know the flight information. Nosotros sabemos la información del vuelo. We know this piece of information, okay? Whether that be the time, the departure gate, whatever. She knows how to check her luggage. Ella sabe facturar el equipaje. You could have written su equipaje in this case as well. Okay, that's something she knows how to do. You probably wanted to put a como. Ella sabe cómo facturar el equipaje. But strangely enough, you don't need it. So that's when that's really convenient. You just have to tell yourself not to throw in that extra como, okay? So these are all three examples. Remember, as we go through the video, I encourage you to pause. I encourage you to rewind. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, so you go at the pace that you need, okay? So next up, I just want to talk about some triggers for saber. And what I mean by triggers, I mean situations that absolutely make saber necessary, okay? We know about pieces of information already. That's not a very specific trigger. But I just wanted to bring to your attention, anytime the answer can be a number, like a date or a time, or like a seat number if you're getting on a plane, those are pieces of information, okay? So I don't necessarily consider that a trigger because it's so general, but just going back to anytime the answer can be a number, that's going to be a piece of information, okay? So here we go with some triggers that trigger you to use saber. Anytime you see que, one without a tilde, and that means that, okay? So here's some examples. I know that you are tall. Anytime you know that something, you're going to use saber, because that's information. I know that we don't have school today. That's a fact. That's information. I know that I need to practice my Spanish. The fact that you need to practice your Spanish is a piece of information, so you're going to use saber. So anytime you see this here, that's a trigger for saber. Anytime you have a conditional, an if, for example, do you know if we have homework? ¿Sabes si tenemos tarea? That's definitely going to use saber because that if is asking for information. Do you know if this is a fact? Okay? Whether you know or not is irrelevant. Do you know if that's a fact? So that's another trigger. And finally, anytime you see an infinitive, because we know that we use saber to talk about how to do stuff or knowing how to do it. So anytime you have an infinitive, then it must be saber. For example, you know how to swim. Tú sabes nadar. These are all things that trigger automatically the use of saber because it makes them either pieces of information or how to do something. So that's saber. Again, I encourage you to pause this, rewind, whatever you need to do, okay? But other than that, if you're ready, let's move on to conocer. Conocer, you're going to want to take a minute and make sure you get down those verb forms. Again, paying special attention to that yo form, okay? We use this verb to talk about knowing things in a sense of being familiar with or being acquainted with. So saber versus conocer can get a little bit tricky because it's not always in our mind this or that. Sometimes it's a little bit intermediate. And here's what I mean by that. We're going to use this with places, people, personas, cosas, things, conceptos, o ideas. Okay? If you are acquainted with something, or have heard of something, or have been to something, or have seen something, that is all about being familiar with. And that is all conocer. So let's look at some examples. I have been to Paris. If you've been to Paris, you are familiar with Paris. Yo conozco París. Okay? They know your brother. If they're familiar with your brother, they know him, they've met him. Ellos conocen a tu hermano. So this is an example that we use conocer with a place. This is an example where we use conocer with a person. And since this is the object of the verb, we have to throw that a in there, that personal a. Don't forget it, okay? She knows the concept of gustar. Now, this is where it gets tricky. Some students say, well, the concept of gustar is information. But we're not talking about she knows the rules of gustar necessarily. We're saying that she's familiar with the concept. She knows it. She's been introduced to it. And we're going to use conocer for that. Ella conoce el concepto de gustar. Okay? So, this last one is tricky because we think of that as information. But if I said, oh, do you know the story of Fox and the Hound? That's something I'm asking. Not do you know every single word of the story like information, but rather, are you familiar with it? Have you ever seen the movie? Have someone told you the information or someone told you the story? That kind of thing. And that makes it a little more conocer-like, okay? Saber is a little more concrete and boxes up well. Conocer is a little more out there. That's how I tend to think of it. So let's look at some triggers for conocer. There aren't a ton, not as many as saber, but two really big ones are anytime you're talking about a place. And it's weird. In Spanish, we don't say, I've been to whatever, Lima, Peru. We're going to say, I know Lima. I've been there, so I know it, okay? So instead of saying, I've been to Cusco, I'm going to say, conozco Cusco. Cusco is my trigger. Cusco is a city. I'm saying I've been there, so I'm going to say conozco. Anytime it's people. So I know your friend. Conozco a tu amigo. The friend triggers the use of conocer because it's something I'm familiar with. All right, someone I'm familiar with in this case. And I don't forget that personal a ever. All right. To wrap up, don't forget you're going to want to make sure you know these conjugations. Pay special attention to those yo forms. It is kind of handy that they're both irregular in the yo form. But you're going to just want to practice, practice, practice. If you need any help, let me know. Again, I encourage you to rewind the video and watch it again. All right, okay? Other than that, see you next time. Bye.